From the anarchic sea that is the Hobbesian Anarchy, the state of nature, one patrolled by roving bandits, which themselves only possess a narrow interest, will inevitably emerge a stationary bandit, one who outcompetes and dominates the lesser bandits of the roving variety, and this stationary bandit will come to possess an encompassing interest in the domain or territory in which he resides. This is the foundation of human civilization. In this video, we will explore the work of Mancur Olson, specifically his book Power and Prosperity, Outgrowing Communist and Capitalist Dictatorships, published posthumously in the year 2000 after his untimely death. A book that was to be published on the eve of what could be called a figurative apocalypse, a transition where one system ended and another began, a new order of sorts. A year or so later, in 2001, China would join the World Trade Organization, and the final stage of the Managerial Revolution that James Burnham prophesied would begin. If the state of nature, the Hobbesian Anarchy, was one of narrow interest groups, and if, as civilization advances and climbs up the complexity hierarchy, the interests of groups become increasingly encompassing, then perhaps there exists a final domain boundary beyond which lies the next frontier, the frontier of the super-encompassing interest, the super-encompassing interest group. While reading the early pages of Power and Prosperity, I had a sort of eureka moment. A sudden understanding about globalization had crystallized for me, and the trajectory of the last 30 years or so suddenly made perfect sense. It was this imperative to create this ultimate super-encompassing interest group, one that would grow to consume the entire world. And it would be one ruled by a technicized, globalized, and delocalized post-national group of elites. One where the necessary condition, overarching global stability, specifically the security of international maritime shipping routes, would be guaranteed by the might of the U.S. military, the world police, while China would become the world's factory. One hand washing the other, a novel system, one in which cooperative participation was guaranteed by a kind of mutually assured destruction, but not one of the nuclear variety, but rather of the economic type. In the decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, while China built its industrial engine, funded by Western foreign direct investment monies, the U.S. would funnel almost all of its remaining investments into information technology, the instruments needed to maintain cybernetic control over an increasingly globalized and technicized economic machine, as well as the increasingly globalized masses. A globalized, technicized machine that possessed an unfathomable capacity to restrain variety in the cybernetic sense, and one in which transactional and frictional costs associated with trade could begin to approach zero. And, or as the theory goes anyway, as this group's interests become super-encompassing, they begin to approach benevolence, and perhaps benevolence on a global scale looks a certain way. But to begin with, we'll start by walking through Mancur Olson's developmental framework from the roving bandits of the Hobbesian Anarchy to the stationary bandits who laid the foundations of cities, states, and empires, and finally to the last stage, the globalized and totalized super-encompassing interest group, which could be described as a totalizing, symbiotic, global manager. And along the way, we'll discuss the theory of Ronald Coase, whose so-called Coase theorem functions not only as an idealized economic model, but also as a basis for an alternative civilizational development theory by which to compare Olson's so-called stationary bandit and encompassing interest model. And perhaps, most interestingly, by exploring the assumptions of Coase's theorem, of which to say there are many, we can also come to understand why nearly all political economic ideologies of the past century, socialism, anarcho-communism, libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, etc., are utopian. But all ideologies, or so I would assert, are all false, merely political formulas that belie some unseen political economic utility. Beyond ideology, there is only the logico-experimental. To begin with, we'll start by defining the Hobbesian anarchy, the state of nature from which we all came. Here, we will entirely disregard Rousseauian Garden of Eden fantasies of peaceful, cooperative humans frolicking in fields, and instead posit that pre-civilization was the law of the jungle. Some people, both atavistic primitivists or idealistic communist types, assuming anyway that any clear dividing line exists between those two groups, will assert that humans lived in cooperative peace and harmony up until the quote-unquote invention of capitalism, up until the great capitalist deceiver tempted Eve with the forbidden fruit, with shiny baubles or some other such nonsense. But we will not entertain such thinking here, and we will start with the primordial state of nature being the Hobbesian anarchy, which, in the words of the eponymous Hobbes, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And generally speaking, the Hobbesian anarchy is defined as the following: a state of nature defined by the total absence of government, absolute individual freedom, and a war of all against all. Or in more simple terms, it is anarchy in the literal sense, and not quote-unquote anarchy in the utopian ideology sense, which is perhaps the most disconnected from reality vision that exists within the pantheon of visions that we could characterize as Rousseauian atavistic primitivism. For those who are ideological quote-unquote anarchists and advocate for anarchy, you could simply choose to live your dream right now. It is merely a plane's flight away, as anarchies still exist today in many places across the globe. They are called failed states, and they are still ruled by warlords or roving bandits in the language of Mancur Olson, and they will be happy to teach you the true meaning of anarchy as they hold you at AK-47 point, strip you of your valuables, and if you are lucky, merely leave you still breathing somewhere on the side of a probably not paved road. Or if you are a female, this is a particularly bad proposition. But perhaps rather than being left in a ditch, you will readily find a fiery-eyed warlord type who wishes to add you to his harem, and perhaps then you would live the actual Handmaid's Tale instead of LARPing about it from the safety and security of your first world problem space. But I digress. Moving on, to quote Mancur Olson on the Hobbesian anarchy and how it relates to the behavior of the individuals who inhabit such systems, to quote Olson, in a Hobbesian anarchy, the incentive to produce is limited by the possibility that what one person produces and the tools or other capital used to produce it will be taken by others. Some of the labor in an anarchic society will be devoted to taking or stealing rather than producing. The stealing naturally imposes costs of guarding assets and other theft-averting behavior. Consider, for example, a family that is focusing on how it will respond to endemic thievery in its anarchic environment. This family will best serve its interests by allocating its efforts so that the last unit of effort devoted to protecting against theft has the same return as the last unit devoted to production. In an anarchy, a family might rationally devote more effort to protecting against theft than to production. And of course, the same logic applies to stealing and production, so some will devote more time to stealing than to production, end quote. So here, we can easily imagine that such a system will be very inefficient and have low productivity for the simple fact that enjoying or benefiting from the fruits of one's productivity is uncertain. Why plan for the future, build or invest time and energy into making something when it is uncertain that such things of stored value won't just be stolen sometime in the very near future? Perhaps above all, one of the most defining features of a Hobbesian anarchy is its uncertainty. And if we want to tie this whole model into thermodynamics, we can easily see that creation of value and value-adding activities, planning, coordinating, building, making, inventing, investing, etc., are examples of order creation or neg-entropy production, whereas in contrast, destroying things, which, mind you, is much easier to do than building things, is an example of entropy, dissolution, and disorder. And as we all exist within the time entropy gradient that is the universe, by the necessity that is the second law of thermodynamics, entropy and disorder are always increasing within the universe spontaneously. and thus, really, the task of building things, creating negentropy in the first place, is in fact already a stacked game, as merely doing nothing and standing still will see the fruits of your labor rot away and eventually dissolve away before your very eyes. That is, so long as a roving bandit does not get to it first. And then we have another glaring inefficiency with respect to time and resource allocation in the Hobbesian state. Every group within the Hobbesian anarchy must invest energy and resources into providing for its own security and defenses, such that it can adequately protect its own productive outputs, resources, and proto-capital from theft by those who choose to primarily pursue thievery rather than production. In other words, not only does this require time, energy, and resources to be split between production and defense, or the so-called theft-averting activities, but it also forces the inhabitants to live as less productive, undifferentiated generalists, rather than as more productive, differentiated specialists, where in systems theory, the developmental trajectory of natural systems follows the familiar path of differentiation, specialization, and centralization, where really this trajectory, as we will see, truly undergirds Olson's theory with respect to the emergence of sedentary bandits and encompassing interests. And on the topic of specialization, we can propose that the first specialization path that emerges will almost always be the specialization route, the skill tree, if you will, of force, thievery, and violence. Really, within the Hobbesian anarchy, force rules the day, and it is a master key of sorts. Why learn how to fish, grow grain, make pottery, or other productive skills when you can merely specialize in force, violence, and thievery, and thus extract all manner of negentropic goods from whomever you see fit? In other words, the first specialty that emerges from the Hobbesian anarchy is the specialty of what Olson refers to as the roving bandit. This concept of the roving bandit is quite self-explanatory, and it is more or less a self-interested coercive force, a criminal force, one that possesses a very narrow interest in the territory over which it roves, coerces, and steals. To quote Olson, "For our focus on coercive power and our analysis of self-interested behavior, I use a criminal metaphor. Clearly, we cannot understand robbery as either a voluntary trade or a moral act, and thus it helps to focus only on the self-interested use of coercive power. Consider the incentives facing the individual criminal in a populous society. Other things being equal, a criminal is better off in a rich society than in a poor society. There is more to steal. Theft also makes societies less prosperous than they would otherwise be. The time devoted to theft produces nothing, but it reduces the reward from productive work and investment and induces a diversion of resources from production into guards, locks, police, prisons, inventory control systems, and the like." End quote. So here, to use thermodynamic terms, theft is highly entropic. Theft itself is not productive, and it not only increases the entropic disorder in a societal or proto-societal system, but it requires resources to be continuously diverted from productive activities, i.e., it enhances the dispersion or dissipation of valuable resources. Notably, in the above passage, Olson is providing us with a more modern version of this metaphor, one in which some semblance of a state must exist already, in that he mentions police, prisons, inventory control systems, etc., all of which are advanced and costly theft deterrence or mitigation strategies. But of course, in the proto-society, theft was even more of a problem than it is today, and as societal systems develop and become more complex, some portion of their total energetic consumption will always be devoted to such defensive theft mitigation activities. As the AI surveillance state begins to expand its all-seeing mesh more and more, perhaps we can, if we wish to be charitable and generous anyway, see this as a pro-social force that will continue to reduce the drain and drag that criminals and thieves inflict on our societies, if we are being charitable anyway. Really, it depends on how you define benevolence and how much you're willing to tolerate the necessary externalities of a quote-unquote benevolent system. And here, perhaps, some will surely say that the elites are themselves criminals, and indeed, that is a fair and accurate statement to make. But there is a difference between elite criminals and criminals from the underclass generally. And the difference has to do with their interest in the system, the difference between the so-called narrow interest and the encompassing interest. An underclass criminal, or the roving bandit from the Hobbesian Anarchy, has only a very narrow interest in the system in which they are marauding about, whereas the so-called elite criminal, or the stationary bandit, which emerges from the Hobbesian Anarchy, has an increasingly encompassing interest in the proto-societal or societal system over which they rule. Here, as an aside, we can understand that this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for the underclasses. Of course, most members of the underclass themselves are probably good and moral people, but they are constantly plagued by an excess of underclass criminals or pseudo-roving bandit types in their environment. Further, we could imagine that since the police and the legal and criminal justice systems will tend to be overwhelmed in underclass areas, and also that they will suffer from a poor tax base, which itself means a lack of strong governmental services, the underclass areas will tend to concentrate such underclass criminals or roving bandit types, who will of course terrorize, extract, and pilfer from the productivity of the proverbial good apples which exist amongst the underclass. Further, as flight from this instability, chaos, and danger is a strong driving force, over time, the more skilled, productive, and motivated members of the underclass will, out of a desire to escape their underclass neighborhoods which are themselves like pseudo-Hobbesian anarchies, those productive members of the underclass will leave the area, and thus the more criminal underclass elements will continue to concentrate and accumulate in the underclass domains of society, a classic feedback cycle. In other words, the whole domain or area becomes a massive repeller of wealth, skill, and talent as a result of this pseudo-Hobbesian anarchic condition. But maybe we'll explore that in a future video. But returning to this concept of the exceedingly narrow interest in the criminal metaphor, we can return to Olson. To quote Olson, "The crime committed by each criminal reduces the wealth of the society, and thus also the amount that is available to steal. Does this make the individual criminal curtail his or her crime? Everyone knows that it does not, but we must understand why. The typical thief in a society of, say, 1 million people bears about 1/1,000,000th of the loss to society that occurs as a result of his crime, whereas he gains nearly 100% of the benefit from his thievery, so long as he is successful. And he alone normally bears the whole loss of whatever opportunities for theft that he passes up. Therefore, the gain to the criminals from a wealthier society and the reduction in that society's wealth due to crime do not keep crime from paying. It is only society's punishment of criminals that keeps crime from paying, and it is not always sufficient to inflict punishment. Though each criminal has a stake in the prosperity of the society, that stake is so minuscule that the criminal ignores it. He normally takes everything there is in any purse or till. As we shall see, it makes a huge difference whether individuals with coercive capacities have a minuscule or narrow stake in the society on the one hand, or an encompassing interest on the other." End quote. So to summarize, the roving bandit or underclass criminal type, those who possess only an exceedingly narrow interest in the society, will basically steal 100% of the pie if given the chance. As a crude example, if you are mugged on the street by a coercive criminal, the thief will demand, and it is a demand and not an ask, "Give me everything you got." Whereas the taxman, the coercive arm of the government, will only take 20 to 50% when they quote-unquote rob you via taxation. This is a very, very simple example of the narrow versus encompassing interest, but it is very illustrative and indeed captures the spirit of Mancur Olson's model very well. The government is a stationary bandit with an encompassing interest over the system that it rules, and thus the stationary bandit maximally benefits by not stealing 100% from its host population, but rather some number that is typically much less, whereas the street criminal, analogous to the Hobbesian roving bandit, has only an exceedingly narrow interest, and he says, "Give me all you got," while brandishing some sort of threat-projecting device at the tender regions of your person. And similarly, despite the protestations of utopianly addled folk, the billionaires do not steal 100% either. Perhaps they quote-unquote steal 20 to 50%, while they are also using their massive surpluses of capital to invest in things, to research things, to build things, etc., because they too have an encompassing interest in the system. Cry about it if you want and hurl predictable slogans, but that is more or less that as far as reality and economics is concerned. But moving forward, we can explore more about how this so-called stationary bandit comes into existence. As a bridging element, Olson uses the mafia as an example of a transitionary group, as some kind of pseudo-state. And of course, there is that old phrase, after all, the government is just a mafia with a monopoly on violence, which implies that the government is merely a mafia that has totalized all power over the domain in which it rules. To quote Olson, "Now let us contrast the individual criminal in a populous community with the head of a mafia family or other criminal gang that can monopolize crime in a neighborhood. Suppose that on some well-defined turf, a criminal gang can not only steal more or less as it pleases, but can prevent anyone else from committing crime there as well. Obviously, the mafia family has an incentive to keep other thieves out of its domain, but will it gain from taking all that it can on its own ground? Definitely not." End quote. So here we can begin to see the emergence of an encompassing interest group. Here, this encompassing interest group acts as a controller of a societal domain. And once this encompassing interest manages to secure a near enough monopoly on violence and a near enough monopoly on control in that particular domain, this controller can set about trying to cultivate and maximize the productivity of the domain, for it will be in its interest to do so, as this controller will be able to reliably and predictably tax the productivity of the domain so long as control is maintained. And the longer the time horizon for this control and the more secure the encompassing interest group's rule over the domain, the more they can invest in the long-term future productivity of their fiefdom. Did you think in past centuries that elites wanted to educate us so that we are able to enjoy the riches of education? No, educating the masses and all other aspects of the social contract for that matter are basically derived from this utility relationship that exists between the masses that inhabit the domain and the elite controller or the encompassing interest group which oversees that domain. It is, as they say in the movies, just business, always business. To quote Olson, "If the business in this domain is made unprofitable by theft or migration away from the neighborhood is prompted by crime, then the neighborhood will not generate as much income, and there will not be as much to steal. Indeed, the mafia family, with a true and continuing monopoly on crime in a neighborhood, will not commit any robberies at all. If it monopolizes crime in the neighborhood, it will gain from promoting business profitability and safe residential life there. Thus, the secure mafia family will maximize its take by selling protection, both against the crime that it would commit itself if not paid, as well as that which would be committed by others if it did not keep out the other criminals. Other things being equal, the better the community is as an environment for business and for living, the more the protection racket will bring in." End quote. Ah, yes, indeed, quite the illustrative passage. And as I alluded to before, really, at the end of the day, a government is just a mafia with a wide and encompassing interest and a monopoly on violence, of which taxation is a form of coercive violence. We can also notice something in that above passage, the spirit of which is captured in the phrase "order out of chaos" or some other various incantation. This phrase is often picked up on by conspiracy theorists as some variant of this phrase has been used as a motto by various organizations throughout history, and they perhaps incorrectly misidentify the significance of it. Order out of chaos is just how things work. We could just as easily say negentropy out of entropy. It is just thermodynamics. And if order is not rendered from chaos, and if the chain of negentropy is not continuously pulled out from the entropic sea, we all cease functioning. Or at the very least, we have to live indefinitely in Hobbes's anarchy, a nasty, brutish, and short existence. In the above mafia example, the mafia employs a timeless mechanism. Predictable and reliable order and stability can be purchased. But if one does not purchase that order, pay the protection fee, so to speak, they will be punished with chaos, either chaos at the hand of the mafia itself, or merely by the Hobbesian anarchy that will inevitably emerge in the absence of the controller, the encompassing interest group, the government, or the mafia. Pick whichever term you like, as they are all interchangeable when viewed in a maximally reduced way. In other words, they are all isomorphic. Hobbes referred to this stabilizing force as the Leviathan. In Stafford Beers's viable system model, this whole thing works as an algedonic loop. The carrots and sticks by which communications are transduced across lower-ordered subsystem boundaries, subsystems which themselves speak only lower-ordered languages incapable of expressing and reconciling the overall and ultimate meta-language of the holistic viable system, the logically higher-ordered languages of thermodynamics, negentropy, profit, incentive, survival, viability. But the carrots and sticks, the algedonic language of nested viable systems, can communicate across any boundary. Here we can quote Stafford Beer on his definition of the metasystem, which includes also a description of the terms meta-language and meta-logic. Generally speaking, it is this elite controller, sedentary bandit, or encompassing interest group which plays the role of the highest logically ordered metasystem, functioning like the overall controller. Further, the controller communicates in the meta-language of utility and self-interest, and in order to communicate with lower-ordered subsystems, the governing metasystem employs algedonic loops, carrots and sticks, pleasure and pain, such that its wishes are communicated efficiently to the lower-ordered subsystems. To quote Beer, metasystem, a system over and beyond a system of lower logical order, and therefore capable of deciding propositions, discussing criteria, or exercising regulation for subsystems that are themselves logically incapable of such decisions and discussions, or are incapable of self-regulation, because the meta-logic is inaccessible to the subsystem's logic, or the meta-language is capable of statements inexpressible in the subsystem's language." End quote. If the greengrocer doesn't pay his protection fee, and suddenly the next day he comes to his shop and it has since gone up in flames, the cost of the shop was much, much greater than the protection fee. And thus, a rational actor merely pays that protection fee in lieu of having his shop burned down. Or, in the language of the Russian mafia, this is called krisha, or roof, where roof implies that the sanctity of the very building in which you are operating is itself only granted to you so long as you pay that protection fee. Torching the very roof and the building that it is attached to would be very costly, but the mafia, the controller, or the encompassing interest group would lose much, much more in terms of reputational cost if it didn't use the stick, or the torch in this case, when it was necessary. Further, the greengrocer may not entirely understand the reason as to why the mafia will torch his shop if they don't receive their protection fee, i.e., he does not understand the logically higher-ordered meta-language of the system and the need for the controller to maintain its reputation, such that it can use the algedonic loops that maintain the overall system's operations, but he certainly understands that getting his shop torched is a bad thing. In other words, it is an algedonic stick, and thus he pays the tax. Further, for the mafia, not using the stick results in the whole ordered system falling down on itself. It results in a loss of that monopoly on violence and a breakdown in that algedonic loop. And, as such, it is merely, as they say, the cost of doing business. But in the West, generally anyway, the government has since managed to almost entirely curtail, or at least absorb, most of those legacy, kneecap-busting, storefront torching mafiosos that we used to make movies about. And many of those old families have since moved inside the system, so to speak, but you can do your own research on that. As they say, never ask a millionaire how they made their first million, but the outcome of this is that today we live in communities that are more or less free from the silver screen mafioso types, but we are still left paying our taxes to the government, the last mafioso standing. However, as we'll mention later, under managerialism, and as a result of our utility having been depleted by decades of deindustrialization, outsourcing, and mass migration, there has emerged another threat mechanism, anarcho-tyranny, which itself is like a sort of deniable, stochastic danger generator that exists to make you need to spend more of your money and more of your paycheck such that you can live in a safe area, one where the police still patrol and one free from kleptomaniacal narco-zombie pseudo-automata, a mechanism that perhaps quite predictably acts to decrease the savings rate of the masses, thereby blocking wealth accumulation and paving the way for the so-called super-encompassing interest group, which is, after all, the topic of this video. We will, proverbially or literally, own nothing and be happy, because to form the highest-ordered, most super-encompassing interest group possible, it is necessary to basically hoover up all the wealth and destroy private property rights, because at the end of the day, to have ownership is to have an interest. And if a group is to become super-encompassing, that group must own and control everything. When the socialist types chant about taking the money from the billionaires, they will fail at that task, but their sentiments will be weaponized and used instrumentally by the growing super-encompassing interest, i.e. by the billionaires and the managerial mesh, to facilitate the expropriation of the remaining wealth from the middle classes, most of which at this point is held in the bank accounts, 401ks, and property values of the baby boomers. Think about that for a moment and ponder why, maybe, have the flames of intergenerational tensions been increasingly fanned by the media in the past decade. As they used to say on the BBC, look around you. And then, just as a reminder, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button and or the hype button if you're on mobile, and consider joining my Patreon or consider becoming a member, a YouTube member. But anyway, back on topic and back to Power and Prosperity by Mancur Olson and this so-called monopoly feature of the controller, to quote Olson. Accordingly, if one mafia family has the power to monopolize crime, there is little or no crime apart from the protection racket. The considerable literature on monopolized crime makes it clear that secure monopolization of crime does in fact usually lead to protection rackets rather than ordinary crime. This criminal metaphor illustrates the theory of narrow and encompassing interests. Whereas the individual in a populous society bears only a minuscule share of the social losses from his crime, the gang, with a secure monopoly on crime in the neighborhood, obtains a significant fraction of the total income of the community from its protection tax theft. Therefore, though the individual criminal normally takes all of the money in the wallet he steals, the secure and rational mafia leader never sets a protection tax rate anywhere near 100%. This would reduce the neighborhood's income so much that the mafia family itself would be a net loser, i.e., the overall taxable revenue of the neighborhood would decrease because of productive flight from the neighborhood, because of the reduced incentive to be productive, etc. End quote. So really, with this so-called criminal metaphor, and by using the mafia as an example, we should already understand the encompassing interest in the stationary bandit phenomenon well enough. Olson goes on to reference Chinese history further, wherein China went from more or less a period of Hobbesian anarchy, one where roving bandits marauded about the countryside, up until some point that a particularly successful roving bandit decided to settle down. And when he settled down, rather than roving and pilfering from the countryside willy-nilly, he became a sedentary bandit, one with an increasingly encompassing interest, just like the mafia in the previous example. And when this roving bandit settled down and became a sedentary bandit, the people rejoiced. For the sedentary bandit is indeed much preferable to the roving bandit in the Hobbesian anarchy. This is also a fact and a dynamic that is lost on the enterprising, self-imagined activists and LARPing revolutionaries of our modern period. Obstructing traffic, destroying property, being a public nuisance, and otherwise annoying the townspeople as they try to go about their business does not win you any friends. Instead, it just discredits you and the cause that you claim to represent, something that is very well understood by savvy power actors. See my video on synthetic counter-revolutions for a deeper dive. But anyway, it was this process, as described by Olson, which ultimately led to the formation of increasingly complex human civilizations. Feudalism in particular is a very explicit example of the sedentary bandit, of the encompassing interest. And then over time, these sedentary bandits expanded until they became fiefdoms, principalities, kingdoms, nation-states, and eventually empires that reached across vast expanses of the globe. And as this occurred, with rampant theft and roving banditry suitably curtailed, Humanity could get down to the business of building things, making things, developing technologies, and otherwise expanding in terms of civilizational complexity, instead of just merely getting beaten up and robbed every other day by whatever new roving bandit group was in their neck of the woods. Roving banditry and the Hobbesian anarchy, in other words, is not conducive to economic prosperity. But of course, in the view of the atavistic primitivist, Rousseauian types, this was all a great tragedy, because they liked to imagine that everyone was merely frolicking instead of being robbed and pillaged by bandits. But you know, everything is like a construct, am I right? If you are a rational systems thinker type, perhaps it is not that surprising that the masses will find the stationary bandit superior to the roving bandit. But perhaps if you are a bit daft, Olson elaborates on the why in the following passage. To quote Olson, "There is good reason for this preference. As we have seen, there is little production in an anarchy, and thus not much to steal. Similarly, for the people who reside in the anarchy, there is little in the way of abundance and security. If the leader of a roving bandit gang, who finds only slim pickings, is strong enough to take hold of a given territory and to keep other bandits out, he can monopolize crime in that area. He then becomes a stationary rather than a roving bandit. The advantage of his monopoly over crime is not mainly that he can take what others might have stolen. It is rather that it gives him an encompassing interest in the territory, akin to that of the Mafia family. He actually has a stronger encompassing interest than the Mafia family, since the stationary bandit leader, who takes over an anarchic area, does not have any competition from government tax collectors. He is the only one who is able to tax or steal in the domain in question. This monopoly of theft changes incentives dramatically. We have seen that the individual criminal in a populous society has such a narrow or minuscule interest in the society that he rationally ignores the damage he does to it, which is also obviously true of gangs of bandits passing through. These socially perverse incentives make anarchies work badly. The encompassing interest of a stationary bandit leader who can continue to keep out not only other criminals, but outside tax collectors as well, gives him an incentive to behave differently. First, it leads him to reduce the percentage he takes from each victim of his theft. And the second way in which the encompassing interest of the stationary bandit changes his incentives is that it gives him an incentive to provide public goods that benefit his domain and benefits those from whom his tax theft is taken." End quote. And in this above passage, we find the emergence of what eventually becomes a proto-state. From the anarchic sea that is the Hobbesian anarchy, the state of nature, one patrolled by roving bandits, which themselves only possess a narrow interest, will inevitably emerge a stationary bandit, one who outcompetes and dominates the lesser bandits of the roving variety, and this stationary bandit will come to possess an encompassing interest in the domain or territory in which he rules. And this sedentary bandit of an increasingly encompassing interest will voluntarily provision public goods to his subjects, because by provisioning his subjects public goods, things like security, infrastructure, and public services, he enriches himself even further, as these public goods contribute to the productivity of his subjects, which thus allows him to extract even more in taxes. This is the foundation of human civilizations. We can imagine that the sedentary bandit, and this encompassing interest group more broadly, acts to form a sort of force field or cocoon around the societal system in question. This cocoon forms a boundary condition within which exists rule of law, governmental or proto-governmental institutions, productivity-enhancing infrastructure, and public goods more broadly. Outside of that boundary, however, in the battle space of inter-system competition, all bets may be off, and thus, even to this day, geopolitics is still largely governed by the law of the jungle. It is the Hobbesian anarchy. Any given geopolitical subsystem, of which the smallest at this point are nation-states, must nest itself inside of a larger, higher-ordered metasystem, otherwise it will be set upon by metaphorical bandits, so to speak. National sovereignty, just like all other political formulas, is merely a myth, or it at least has been since the end of World War II, which ushered in the age of the superstate. And today, honestly, in my opinion, there's only one increasingly totalized and increasingly delocalized controlling metasystem, a globalized, technicized metasystem of the super-encompassing interest. Or not, maybe I'm wrong, although I don't know which option is scarier, to be frank. But anyway, within the stable societal cocoon created by the sedentary bandit, or encompassing interest group more broadly, differentiation and specialization of the masses that reside within it become possible. And as a result, new innovations and new technologies can be made such that the societal system can begin climbing up the complexity ladder and ultimately expanding its influence to make its encompassing interest even more encompassing, climbing up the envelope curve, one logistics curve at a time, as long as its growth continues anyway. We can also briefly mention that culture plays a significant role in this, i.e., the emergence of innovative and more inclusive cultures will itself enable the system to expand, propagate itself, and grow its domain further and further. In Europe, for example, almost all nations went through consolidation phases, where the principalities and sub-kingdoms, ones populated by different tribes or ethnic groups, were ultimately smashed into one single, mostly harmonized national identity, a process of identity consolidation, if you will. In the modern context, especially post-World War II, this cultural innovation is marked by the development of strategies that effectively and efficiently detribalize and deracinate increasingly disparate groups, as this allows the group size to expand. The culture of the U.S., as well as the various strategies employed by universalizing socialism and communism, most notably the Soviet system, sought to strip people of their past tribal and ethnic identities and to instead reform the populace into a detribalized and deracinated mass, ones patched and glued together with increasingly synthetic cultural ideologies. In the context of Valentin Turchin and his metasystem hierarchy, Quantum 7, the next emerging metasystem is the control of culture itself, one where perhaps culture becomes infinitely rewritable and fluid, a commodity even. But really, this fluidization of culture is done such that the overall societal metasystem can accommodate greater mass and scale. But I've made several past videos where I went in depth on this, so I won't elaborate too much here. Tribal and clan-based systems especially are very limited in terms of scope and scale. Further, they often resemble the very roving bandit gangs of the Hobbesian Anarchy, i.e., tribal and clan-based societies maintain very clear in-group, out-group boundaries, generally have fairly small population sizes, and any group beyond the in-group boundary, more or less, is fair game. In other words, it can be very zero-sum. In some cases, morality can be entirely determined by the in-group, out-group distinction, i.e., tribal alliance itself determines morality. Perhaps it is no accident that most failed states today still largely have tribal or clan-based societal structures. The emergence of a complex, centralized state in many ways is antithetical to tribal and clan-based societal systems, or really at best, different tribes or clans will merely take turns running the government, stealing things on behalf of their tribe, and then frequent changes of government may be likely to occur via coup d'etat or otherwise non-peaceful and thus destructive processes. And yes, Dorothy, sometimes the U.S. government or some other self-interested geopolitical actors play a meddling role in the whole affair. But next, we can discuss an alternative model or theory that competes with Olson's sedentary bandit model, Coase's theorem, Coasean bargains, or more generally, the theory of mutually advantageous transactions. And Coase's theorem also addresses the notion that negative externalities that arise between market participants can be resolved spontaneously by the market, i.e., without government or state-like entity intervention, so long as private property rights are clearly defined and so long as transactional costs are suitably low, which we will discuss more in a bit. And really, so much of what people complain about on a socio-political economic level are these so-called negative externalities, and thus Coase's theorem is of broad interest. As we will see, however, Coase's theorem, or libertarian-style and anarchic-style theories of voluntary association and voluntary transaction generally are inherently utopian, as they basically exclude environmental factors entirely, especially the force and coercion mechanic, or in other words, they naively exclude power from their models. They assume that the environment is by default a neutral or even a fair and friendly sandbox, or otherwise that the environment is already controlled and managed by something resembling Olson's sedentary bandit, an encompassing interest, or a functional and reasonably fair state that acts as an impartial and all-powerful referee, a state-like entity which provides a force field of law and order, thereby restraining the Hobbesian anarchy. But the following will be a bit of a digression in economic theory, so if you want, I'll put a timestamp on screen, and if you want to skip ahead past this economic discussion, feel free. Skipping it won't really take that much away from the overall argument of this video, although you will miss out on an exploration of Coasean bargaining, which broadly is central to many political economic ideologies, as well as to the modern ideology of tech disruption. And of course, as a disclaimer, I'm not an economist, but we'll go ahead and throw ourselves into the deep end anyway. First, we can lay out some of the assumptions necessary for this so-called Coasean bargaining. This competing theory that Olson introduces as a counterpoint to his own assumes that all economic transactions are voluntary, which they are not. Some transactions are entirely needed or are otherwise totally inelastic and thus non-voluntary. And the more necessary or inelastic certain transactions become, like accessing water, food, or healthcare, for instance, the greater the incentive for predatory coercion and strong-arming. Further, in order for a transaction to be voluntary, there must be a lack of extreme asymmetry between all parties, which of course, in reality, is almost never the case. Further, Coase's theorem assumes that transaction costs within the system will be exceedingly low, approaching zero even, which generally is not the case, especially if there is no sedentary bandit or powerful encompassing interest around that itself invests and maintains the public infrastructure, assures territorial defense, guarantees private property rights, guarantees a reasonable degree of law and order, etc., etc. As an example, a merchant cannot merely transport his wares across a bandit-infested highway if there is no law and order. Without law and order, transactional costs are exceedingly high for our merchant, to say the least. Further, Coase's theorem assumes that property rights are clearly defined, and that there exists somewhere within the system an independent arbiter of property rights, i.e., some entity which has what could only be described as a monopoly on violence or the capacity to compel or enforce the execution of a supposedly voluntary transaction, or to assure that such a transaction is not conducted under duress, i.e., a state-like entity or Hobbesian leviathan which will serve this function. And of course, perhaps oxymoronically, if the voluntary nature of a transaction must be enforced by some external state-like entity, then perhaps the transaction was never entirely voluntary in the first place, but perhaps that is semantic pedantry. But to quote Olson on this topic of an alternative theory that competes with his sedentary bandit model, as it happens, with one partial exception, there is nothing in the way of alternative theories that deal with the issues examined in Chapter 1 and 2, i.e. the sedentary bandit model, the emergence of a powerful encompassing interest, and the importance of guaranteed property rights, wherein the property rights must be guaranteed and enforced by some entity powerful enough to do so. Mostly, there is only a jumble of ad hoc arguments and some fancy jargon, yet there is one fascinating alternative proto-theory emerging in the literature which is still being formulated, and thus the alternative theory or proto-theory needs some additional development, and I will attempt to develop it in this chapter. The alternative proto-theory begins with an analogy to the voluntary transaction in the marketplace. Many of the best insights in the alternative theory are in the literature of the Chicago School of Political Economy. To understand the alternative theory, a knowledge is required of fundamental ideas about the gains from trade, transaction costs, the theory of market failure, and Coasean bargains." End quote. The alternative theory that Olson fleshes out focuses on voluntary transactions and the notion that it is transaction costs that limit voluntary exchange and bargaining. And if transaction costs all across the system drop so significantly that they start approaching zero or otherwise become negligible, then something magical is supposed to happen, where transaction costs are any friction that exists when some economic exchange takes place. This notion of driving transaction costs down really is one of the primary ingredients of so-called tech disruption. And if you learn this concept of transactional costs, this becomes very obvious. Now, transaction cost is very broad, and it applies to the free flow of information, i.e. the communicational transaction costs of finding, getting, receiving, and processing information, which is itself a transaction, as well as to the cost or difficulty in executing the actual physical transaction in the first place. Or really, we could say that all transactions are first informational/communicational, and then typically there is some kind of physical world transaction element that occurs subsequently. We can see that e-commerce platforms especially thrive by driving transaction costs lower and lower, both with respect to their ability to dramatically reduce communicational transaction costs, as well as their ability to reduce the transactional cost of actually buying and receiving the good or service. And they do that by building massively efficient, expansive, and sophisticated logistics networks. This is why e-commerce platforms have all but put the biggest economies of scale-wielding brick-and-mortar retail stores out of business. And the reason for this is as follows. On an e-commerce platform, you do not need to drive down to the store, get out, walk yourself into the store, navigate the store, locate something that approximates what you think you're looking for, mosey over to the cashier, which will probably be either an elderly, glacier-pace moving, disinterested retail worker, or merely a young, fight the system by doing as bad of a job as possible until your accrued negative externalities justify your replacement by a robot, glacier-paced moving, disinterested retail worker, and then, there, at the point of sale, you pay for your product, and then you repeat much of the process in reverse as you transport your own purchase back home. Whereas e-commerce platforms make the communicational transactional costs very low via predictive shopping algorithms, recommendations, and search bars. And of course, buying something and completing the physical transaction process is typically a 1 to 3 click affair, as your payment info is probably already saved, and then by the magic of supply chains, 1 to 3 days later, the thing you ordered just magically shows up on your doorstep. In other words, e-commerce displaces and outcompetes brick and mortar because it annihilates the transaction cost of buying something. In the pure idealized utopian land of hardcore libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism, similarly, if transaction costs were to approach zero, it is said there would be no need to even have corporations or hierarchical firms, since the people could just freely and voluntarily transact between one another with absolutely zero friction. Say that you have too many apples. You would instantly know that Cindy needs apples, and that Cindy, in turn, has too much of something else that you need. If communicational transaction costs approach zero, and if the physical transaction costs approach zero, you and Cindy could both snap your fingers and resolve your needs and balance in a frictionless manner without having to involve any megacorps or the government. Your surplus apples would be instantly traded to Cindy in exchange for whatever thing she had in surplus, and at a rate that both she and you felt was an equivalent exchange rate with respect to your surplus apples. But of course, things don't work out that way, do they? And especially so when we consider geographic distance and transportation costs. Tech companies often try to facilitate friction-free transactions and often seek to approximate this with their disruptive or supposedly disruptive services. Those tech companies that sought to disrupt the car rental business, as an example, did so by trying to coordinate vehicle sharing. In the case of tech-facilitated vehicle sharing, indeed, we can imagine a silver-tongued, exotic stimulant-powered tech deck slinger giving a presentation to investors about how their startup and proprietary algorithm would drive transactional costs of vehicle sharing down so low that rental car companies would go extinct. But of course, transactional costs never really get down that low, do they? There are always many complicating factors. Similarly, anarcho-communist types rely on a similar logic. They assume that the transactional costs of sharing and voluntarily transacting, such that everyone's needs are suitably and fairly optimized, is an easy, frictionless affair. Same goes for the communicational transaction cost of figuring out who needs what and why in the first place. They assume that this happens almost instantaneously, and that no bad faith actors within the system will fraudulently misrepresent either their needs or their capacity to contribute. Jerry is over there claiming his leg is hurt again, and thus he cannot work. Susie feels that Jerry is lying. He is faking his limp, just like he did 2 months ago. She knows it. Why should she have to work harder? So smug-faced Jerry over there can sit in the shade with his fake leg injury and eat the productive outputs of Susie's labor. Inevitably, Susie smothers Jerry in his sleep. But perhaps we could imagine a small collective of 10 or maybe even 100 people sorting all of this out. especially if they excluded probably 90% of the population and only accepted the most altruistic into their little commune existence. But it does not work at scale. Modern nation-states are tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even a billion plus. Without the state-like entity, Hobbes's Leviathan or Olson's sedentary bandit, too many Susies will be smothering too many Jerrys in their sleep. Further, if we head back over to digital e-commerce land, we can see that simply driving transaction costs into the ground won't magically fix everything, i.e., where magically fix everything implies that all negative externalities can be resolved and dissolved away by frictionless voluntary transactions. As an example, in our modern age of digital commerce, the friction of buying something online has indeed rapidly approached zero, thanks to one-click buy options, stored payment info, the availability of credit and buy now, pay later schemes, as well as extremely fast and sometimes free delivery. But this near zero transaction cost does nothing with respect to your ability to quote-unquote bargain with an e-commerce giant on the platform. And in reality, since the e-commerce giants are much more sophisticated than the average user, an example of a profound asymmetry in the capacity to handle cybernetic variety, really the near zero transaction costs merely harm the average user, since it basically facilitates impulsive and ill-advised spending that leads to crippling debt. Where, ironically, this crippling debt that is facilitated by the near zero transaction costs of e-commerce platforms contributes to a massive amount of moral hazard, which itself is a negative externality, and if it is bad enough, the accumulated debt from this behavior can cause a total market failure, which again is ironic because Coase's theorem is supposed to, theoretically, be a means by which individuals in the market can themselves solve and remedy negative externalities and prevent market failures without the help of the government via such frictionless voluntary transactions. And then to make matters worse, Coase's theorem and its theoretical claim that it is possible to spontaneously remedy market externalities is only valid when there are only a few parties affected by the market externality. So just as we saw with the Great Financial Crisis, if you blow up a giant catastrophic bubble of moral hazard that affects millions and millions of people, there is no way to spontaneously remedy this enormous negative externality, as even a vanishingly small transaction cost multiplied by tens of millions of people becomes insurmountable. And because such financial crises impact everyone, regardless of if they were engaging in whatever stupid, ill-advised, rigged game was being played at that time, everyone suffers, a collective or public bad rather than a good, and there is no remedy other than to have the value of your savings rapidly decline as the governmental intervention, the printing of billions or even trillions of dollars, is necessary because your fellow co-members of the mass were too dumb to realize that they couldn't afford a $500,000 house on a $30,000 a year salary. But of course, your financially illiterate co-member of the mass himself was totally outgunned by the asymmetric sophistication of the collective financial, corporate, and governmental managerial mesh, which seemingly cooperated to set up the whole rigged game in the first place. So, c'est la vie. Further, with respect to online marketplaces, the ultra-low transactional costs of online marketplaces are themselves possible only because of the digital infrastructure, which is itself controlled and at least partially paid for by the tech giants, which themselves are examples of ultra-sophisticated, nearly monopolistic, profit-maximizing leviathans, i.e. they are maximally and asymmetrically advantaged over you, the lowly consumer, rather than being benign entities that are merely part of the shared and collective commons. If you wanted to start your own e-commerce business, you could indeed do so very cheaply. The transaction costs of using the market for a small e-commerce operator have become vanishingly small. But your small size and lack of economies of scale will not allow you to directly compete with e-commerce leviathans unless you offer some very particular niche product, a very niche product that will itself in all likelihood be totally elastic and not very necessary to your consumers, since we could assume that monopolistic e-commerce giants will use their sophistication to identify and corner any slack that is in the market for necessary inelastic products. So at best, the small operator could sell handmade crafts, fun things like toys or branded white-labeled products, of which influencers are always selling some array of overpriced white-labeled drinks, supplements, or food items as an example. But anyway, back on topic. Generally, this alternative theory that Olson lays out as a counter to his sedentary bandit theory is a Chicago School of Economics efficiency model that uses Coase's theorem, which itself deals with transactional costs, externalities, and emergent market magic. More or less, compared to Olson's theory of the sedentary bandit, which is basically a power theory, Coasean bargaining, when applied to civilizational development, is a type of power-free, pure market emergence theory, which Olson offers as the only available counter-theory to his own, i.e., this counter-theory proposes that civilization emerges as a result of mutually beneficial voluntary transactions, i.e., non-coercive transactions that are carried out between participants. And as a point of clarification, Coase's theorem in Coasean bargaining is just an economic theory at its most basic level. But what Olson is doing in this book is repackaging Coasean bargaining into an alternative theory for the purpose of counterbalancing and testing his own theory of the sedentary bandit and the encompassing interest. But as we will see when we learn more about Coase's theorem, it is a theory that contains multiple assumptions that, in my opinion anyway, underpin many popular and very influential political and economic ideologies, namely libertarianism / anarcho-capitalism and communism / anarcho-communism. So in other words, it's worth diving into a bit. So we'll dive into Coase's theorem a bit, as it is actually quite interesting when it is applied more broadly to political economic ideologies. Further, it introduces us to the concept of transactional costs, which are an exceptionally powerful and useful addition to the analytical toolkit. To quote Olson on the topic of Coase's theorem and transactional costs, if hierarchical firms thrive in a competitive market, their hierarchies must be able to coordinate the production and activities that take place within the firm at a lower cost than the market would have incurred. That is, at a lower cost than if individual workers, suppliers of materials, and owners of machines had been spontaneously coordinated by the market, i.e., the total internal transactional cost of using the firm's hierarchy must be lower than the total external transaction costs of the spontaneously coordinated market if the firm is to be profitable and thus viable. In a competitive environment, the hierarchical firms would not be viable if the goals that they produced were more expensive than the market, i.e., the firm would not be viable if the outputs of the firm were more costly than what the market would have spontaneously arranged. When hierarchical firms are profitable, all costs or disadvantages of using the market, which economists in the Coasean tradition like to lump together and call transactional costs, must exceed the costs of using a firm's hierarchy to coordinate that production, end quote. So, in other words, the internal transaction costs of the firm's hierarchy must be less than the market's transactional costs if the market were to spontaneously arrange whatever goods or services that the corporation's hierarchy is providing, or the firm's hierarchy is providing, in more plain English. So if we extrapolate from that above passage, if theoretically transactional costs in the market approached zero, i.e. the friction of using the market for any given transaction became virtually zero, then the cost of maintaining the firm's hierarchical structure, i.e. the organizational costs of a big firm or megacorporation, would itself have to approach zero in order for a hierarchical firm to stay profitable relative to the pure market. More or less, it is the idea that if the market becomes super efficient, thanks to advances in information technology especially, and if transaction costs begin to approach zero, then hierarchy itself would become obsolete and unnecessary, and the purely efficient market of near-zero transaction costs would simply result in a sea of individual, freely transacting, rational homo economicuses flitting about, free and out from under the oppressive thumb of the government, megacorporations, monopolies, oligarchies, etc. This forms a sort of fundamental premise of the anarcho-libertarian open-source tech bro argument, i.e. information technology, AI agents, open-source, decentralized software will democratize business and eventually destroy the value proposition of the big tech leviathans. But this argument disregards the fact that reductions in transactional costs that result from the information technology infrastructure improving are reduced both within the firm as well as outside the firm's boundaries, i.e. the firm itself just becomes even more internally efficient, and it can still leverage its vast capital hoards, its existing hardware infrastructure, i.e. its commercial-scale data centers, and its economies of scale to continue to outcompete and dominate any small actor who is leveraging the same or similar information technology tools that are available open source, somewhere freely available out in the wilds of the market. Or alternatively, a small operator grows large enough until it receives an offer that it cannot refuse, and thus it is ultimately absorbed by the Leviathan. And again, we're constraining this argument to the digital sphere. It is even worse in the physical world reality of logistical supply chains and the movement of real mass. As they say, only mass moves mass, and the corporate leviathans are massive. The transaction cost of moving one shipping container from China to the US will shrink, but it will always be almost infinitely higher than shuttling around bits and boops with a computer. And of course, the transaction costs never actually reach zero, even in the digital sphere. So if a tech leviathan has a power factor of 1 million, and the small tech bro only has a power factor of 1, and if we multiply the power factor by some deployment cost of an AI agent swarm that approaches but never reaches zero, for example, the product of the tech leviathan will still be 1 million times higher than our enterprising crypto tech bro. And if you think a delocalized collective of 1 million crypto tech bros would then equal the tech leviathan's power factor of 1 million, you'd be wrong again, because that 1 million strong crypto tech bro collective will itself have tremendous transactional or internal coordinational costs that will severely reduce the overall output compared to the standardized, hierarchical, and more coordinated tech leviathan. It is just another example of both Michels's iron law of oligarchy and Mosca's law of the organized minority, which always rules over the disorganized majority, I'm afraid. Or in other words, it is a problem of transactional and coordinational costs. And besides the more abstract notions of transactional and coordinational costs, it still comes down to capital, hard power, electricity, steel, millions of gallons of cooling water, and billions of dollars worth of silicon chippies. Random anarcho-capitalist tech bro can deploy a swarm of AI agents on his local hardware, but a tech giant will deploy those same AI agents, but scaled up by a factor of 1,000, 1,000,000, or even 1,000,000,000. And that doesn't even get into issues like data poisoning and countermeasures. A swarm can always be dwarfed and swallowed up by a bigger swarm. As they say, war never changes, and at the end of the day, it is always mass, scale, and power, that is all. Real war is always attritional. If it is not attritional, it is not a real war. But that is sort of a digression, but something that I realized while bothering to flesh out this economic derivation. And then the rest of the Coasean counter-argument just seems to overly rely upon the presumed magic of mutually beneficial exchanges or voluntary transaction, which, as I already hammered well enough above, totally disregards power differentials, inelasticity, and asymmetries with respect to sophistication or capacity. In other words, none of it is that compelling. And to be fair, Olson did say that there was not really any theory that strongly competed and rivaled his own sedentary bandit theory, but it was worth the exercise to explore some of these more academic-y theories, like Coasean bargaining, as to me anyway, they are often so layered with unrealistic assumptions and caveats that they are almost entirely meaningless in the real world, except for whatever base political utility that they provide to the power structures, the utility of justifying various things with fancy-sounding terms and jargon. And to me anyway, for whatever it's worth, Olson's theory of the sedentary bandit and the encompassing interest is indeed superior to whatever academic ease, magic market efficiency emergence counter-theories exist out there, which more or less imply that civilization purely emerges as a result of mutually beneficial, voluntary, and non-coercive transactions. And I think Olson's theory is clearly superior because it does not neglect power as many academic theories typically do, and it actually uses power as a central element and in a logical and coherent way. And of course, market participants can and do engage in a vast array of mutually beneficial, voluntary transactions, but this is certainly not always true. And we can surmise when the stakes are especially high, it probably almost never is. And instead, this voluntary, mutually beneficial element is rapidly displaced by a coercive one. And as Burnham said, only power restrains power, or perhaps only an equal or greater threat of coercive force restrains the equal or weaker threat of coercive force. But continuing on with this alternative Coasean theory, as it will continue to pay dividends with respect to further populating our analytical toolkit and for the purpose of dismantling utopian ideologies, to quote Olson, just as individuals can often serve their interests through voluntary transactions, some of them can sometimes also serve their interests through the threat of and sometimes through the use of force. When an individual has much more power than another, he may better be able to serve his interest by threatening to use or by using force than by voluntary exchange. he may be able to obtain for free what would otherwise be costly, end quote. So yes, for the Rousseauian types out there, there is always that age-old problem, the asymmetric capacity to coerce into use force. Further, as I explored in my last video, there is the link between elite theory and cybernetics, between Burnham and Ashby. Only power restrains power, and only variety restrains variety. So perhaps two reasonably symmetrically attributed, rational actors can engage in the Coasean bargain to engage in the mutually advantageous and non-coercive transaction, but most likely, when in the high-stakes arena where the big boys play, there is probably quite a bit of coercion, or at the very least, that is always an option. And the big boys don't like to lose, so probably more often than not, all of the available cards that can be played get played, of which the coercion card is certainly one. But to quote Olson, who elaborates more on the logic of Coase's theorem, under the header, why the Coasean theory is utopian, it is not difficult to see how the paradigm of mutually advantageous transaction, i.e. the Coasean bargain, and the transaction costs associated with it can help us account for good outcomes. When people voluntarily engage in transactions, the transactions, in the absence of fraud or mistakes, make them better off. If they continue to engage in a given pattern of transactions, there must be no fraud or mistake. Their interests are served. If you start with the assumptions of the Coasean bargain and transaction cost approach and make no logical mistakes, you inevitably keep coming back to the conclusion that the social equilibrium that such a system leads to is Pareto efficient, or at least to an approximation, i.e., where a Pareto efficient state or situational outcome is one where it is not possible to make one person better off without making someone else worse off, regardless of the distribution of income that results at this equilibrium point, end quote. But of course, despite the structural logic of Coase's theorem checking out, it does not hold up well to empirical reality, especially at the extreme ends of the spectrum, at the extreme ends where profound asymmetries and power imbalances reign supreme. And indeed, civilization and empire building is something that happens on the extreme ends of the spectrum. Thus, logico-experimentally, it must be rejected as a theory that explains the emergence of civilization. Coase's theory makes certain assumptions about the environment, or to use cybernetic terms, it makes assumptions about the degree to which variety is restrained in the environment, as well as about the variety handling capacity of the participants involved. With these assumptions being, in simple and concise form, 1. The good faith assumption, 2. The symmetry assumption, 3. The voluntary and elastic assumption, and 4. The sedentary bandit assumption. And to elaborate in more detail, number 1. The good faith assumption assumes that all of the participants in the environment are rational and are operating in good faith, i.e. they will not use, or at least cannot use, violence or forceful coercion, nor will they cheat. 2. The symmetry assumption assumes that all participants in the environment are roughly equal with respect to their power, capacity, resources, access to information, etc., i.e. an absence of profound asymmetries between the participants. As a note, we can also think of this in cybernetic terms, i.e. each participant is roughly equivalent with respect to their capacity to handle and restrain variety. 3. The voluntary and elastic assumption assumes that all of the transactions are in fact voluntary. The goods or services being transacted are not prohibitively inelastic necessities, and that a suitably high number of goods and service providers exist within the market, such that a person can indeed make their transactions in a truly voluntary fashion, i.e. hypothetically, if I need a cell phone, and if the only providers of cell phones are collusionary pseudo-monopolies, then I simply cannot walk away from the transaction. So nested within this assumption, further, is the requirement that monopolies and collusionary cartels are suitably absent from the environment, i.e. they are restrained somehow by the environment. Which leads us to assumption 4. The sedentary bandit assumption assumes that there exists a field exerted by a stationary bandit, or otherwise a reasonably stable, state-like entity which holds a functional monopoly on violence, maintains a suitably encompassing interest with respect to the governance of the system, provides a suitable degree of rule of law, guarantees private property rights, and maintains the infrastructure such that the transactional costs are indeed reasonably low, with this fourth assumption perhaps being a true prerequisite, as it is this state or encompassing interest group which provides for the conditions necessary such that the Hobbesian anarchy is avoided in the first place. And as a note here, by including the sedentary bandit as one of the assumptions and preconditions for Coase's theorem, I am implying that Coase's theorem is indeed downstream of Mancur Olson's theory, i.e. in order for Coase's theorem to work, It is itself dependent and subordinate to Olson's theory of the emergent sedentary bandit, the one which holds back the Hobbesian anarchy. Or in other words, the sedentary bandit clause is like a power clause. So in other words, purely relying upon the magic of markets, voluntary exchange, and the so-called Coasean bargain will fall flat on its face when it runs up against power. The market is a powerful, dynamic, and emergent thing, but power can distort the space-time fabric of the market, just like one of those physics demonstrations wherein a bowling ball is tossed onto a stretched-out piece of fabric. In other words, power trumps the market. This is the so-called dark side of the force, to quote Olson. Just as individuals can often serve their interests through voluntary transactions, some of them can sometimes also serve their interests through the threat of and sometimes through the use of force. When an individual has much more power than another, he may be better able to serve his interests by threatening to use or by using force than by voluntary exchange. He may be able to obtain for free what would otherwise be costly. Thus, the same rational self-interest that makes voluntary exchange mutually beneficial, and that, when guided by the invisible hand of the market, can serve the interests of society, can also lead those with power to coerce others. There is also, in Jack Hirschleifer's words, a dark side of the force, end quote. So yes, indeed, coercion is a thing, and further, not all transactions are indeed voluntary. Much of the assumptions that underpin libertarian or anarcho-capitalist ideologies often imagine a utopian landscape where coercion is rendered impossible, i.e., one where the coercion mechanic is suitably restrained by the environment because the market supposedly will emergently punish coercive behavior enough such that it does not pay to coerce, and with a further assumption being that transactions are voluntary and are carried out between relatively equal, rational homo economicuses. All of these reality elements complicate Coase's theorem and certainly complicate the notion that Coasean bargaining and civilizational development is fundamentally driven by efficient, mutually beneficial and voluntary exchanges. In other words, it is utopian. And this is especially the case when it comes to the big leagues where the big boys play for big stakes. To quote Olson, when we drop the assumption that all interactions are voluntary, the implication that social outcomes are necessarily efficient disappears. The party with power gains from threatening to use or by using that power if the cost of doing this is less than the value to that party of what is obtained. The losses to the victim and even the size of these losses in relation to the gains to the party with power do not necessarily bear in the outcome, end quote. And then, using some of this economic terminology and the four assumptions that must be met when Coase's theorem is valid, we can quickly demonstrate that the main politico-economic ideologies from the past century or so are utopian. Because, as we will see, all of these ideologies of political economy rely upon Coase's theorem at their core. And to reiterate, the four relevant assumptions of Coase's theorem are as follows. 1. The good faith assumption. All participants are operating in good faith and cannot use coercion. 2. The symmetry assumption. There are no profound asymmetries between participants. 3. The voluntary and elastic assumption. All transactions are voluntary, i.e., no one provider of a good or service has a total or near monopoly, and that all goods and services transacted are either elastic and non-necessary, or if they are inelastic and necessary to sustain life, then there are multiple suppliers that are not in a monopolistic, oligopolistic, or otherwise collusionary agreement. And 4, the stationary bandit assumption. A suitably encompassing interest group, such as a government or state-like entity, must exist such that the conditions of the Hobbesian anarchy are sufficiently restrained, private property rights are guaranteed, a suitable level of law and order is guaranteed, etc., etc. And then the politico-economic ideologies, which we'll discuss, will include socialism and anarchism broadly, and then we'll devote extra attention to libertarianism / anarcho-capitalism and communism / anarcho-communism. Again, one can argue about the precise definitions or flavors of ideologies, but I'm going to fairly broad brush them here. Make sure to leave your well-thought-out thoughts in the comments, or alternatively, angry type your predictable, sentiment-laden, slogan-based utterances there if you'd like. With respect to socialism and anarchism, I previously used Robert Meikles' Iron Law of Oligarchy to demonstrate that socialism and anarchism are utopian. So just refer back to that video for a more detailed analysis in that vein. But we can also use the analytical concept of the transaction cost to further demonstrate that mass collective action and mass collective decision-making is itself futile. And in my opinion anyway, socialism and anarchism Both rely upon the assumption that mass collective action and mass collective decision-making is possible in the first place. So using Coase's theorem and transactional costs as an analytical element, the masses or the majority can never quote-unquote rule themselves because of 1, the large number of participants inherent to the mass or inherent to the majority, and 2, the per capita non-zero transaction cost or per capita coordination cost that corresponds to the masses attempting to identify, coordinate, and resolve whatever is supposedly in their best shared common collective interest, when multiplied by the large number of the members of the mass, results in a total multiplicative product which is prohibitively and impossibly high, and thus collective management is not remotely functional or viable when conducted at scale. Emphasis on at scale. If you want to do this in your backyard cooperative of 20 people, maybe you can be successful, but you can't do it when there are hundreds of thousands, and especially not when there are millions upon millions of people involved. It is simply a problem of mass and scale, and therefore, in lieu of this mass collective self-management being viable, there must always be an organized, hierarchical, oligarchical, smaller numbered minority ruling class somewhere, and that somewhere is the societal driver's seat, or the societal controller, if you will. And this problem is inherent to the mass by virtue of it being a mass, to quote Robert Meikles. The objective immaturity of the mass is not a mere transitory phenomenon which will disappear with the process of democratization and in the aftermath of socialism. On the contrary, it derives from the very nature of the mass as mass. For this, even when organized, suffers from an incurable incompetence for the solution of diverse problems which present themselves for solution, because the mass per se is amorphous intrinsically, and therefore needs division of labor, specialization, and guidance." End quote. Mancur Olson's previous work on the logic of collective action also went in depth on why large groups can never collectively organize successfully when compared to smaller groups, which is itself an economically framed variant of Moska's law, where the disorganized majority is always ruled by an organized minority due to the prohibitively high cumulative transactional or coordinational costs of organized large groups. Similarly, I used a vector cancellation example in the past as well to demonstrate that the so-called collective interest vector will always cancel out relative to the direction and strength of the vector that is exerted by the organized minority ruling class, i.e., the elite ruling class vector is more focused and more coordinated due to the sheer and unavoidable fact that the elite group has less numerical members, and thus coordinational friction is orders of magnitude lower. In other words, it is possible for 5 people to agree on something that is determined to be all in their best interest, whereas it is much harder for 500 people to do the same. In fact, in many cases, it is totally impossible. Further, as the group size increases, the share of the collective benefit that each person receives decreases, such that they have even less incentive to bother with paying the transactional and coordinational costs associated with participation in the first place. And then, with respect to libertarianism/anarcho-capitalism, which advocates for a sort of stateless, purely market-led system, it is utopian because it assumes that transactions are all voluntary, that all participants are good faith actors with roughly symmetrical or equivalent capacities, and it entirely disregards the coercion mechanic, or really it merely asserts that the market itself will spontaneously restrain the coercive capacity of any given participant within the system by virtue of the asserted fact that coercion is inefficient, and thus the market will always gravitate towards efficient outcomes, which definitionally will have been brought into being via voluntary rather than coerced transactions. Further, of course, the notion that this can all be done without a state, a belief held by anarcho-capitalists, violates the fourth assumption of Coase's theorem, which is that a powerful sedentary bandit, one of a suitably encompassing interest, must exist to maintain law and order, guarantee usage rights, quell the Hobbesian anarchy, etc. And of course, anarcho-capitalism has the prefix anarcho, which implies that its ideology precludes the existence of a state-like entity or sedentary bandit in the first place, and thus, in my view anyway, it is obviously utopian. And then with respect to communism/anarcho-communism, similarly, these ideologies reject the notion of a state-like entity or sedentary bandit, and oddly enough, just like the anarcho-capitalists, which are their ideological arch-rivals, equally rely upon Coasean bargaining and Coase's theorem, i.e. they assume that even with no state or sedentary bandit, the collective masses in all their definitional multitude will simply, spontaneously, and voluntarily transact and share with one another in a mutually advantageous way, such that the needs of every member of the mass is spontaneously resolved via Coasean bargaining, and that all of this will happen without anyone resorting to coercion, force, violence, or pushing to rebuild the state, such that they can wield its reins and pull its levers. Pure utopia, but I digress. And similarly, with respect to transactional costs, a large anarcho-communist system with millions of members would have a total transactional friction product that is roughly equal to the number of members of the mass times the average transactional or frictional cost associated with each quote-unquote collectively decided decision. In such a system, due to the massive amount of transactional and decisional friction, nothing would get done. Everyone would be angry, and it would only be a matter of time before some enterprising elite aspirant decided to rebuild the state, and the whole silly experiment would be over in no time. If the Leviathan is forcefully disassembled, it will reassemble and reanimate spontaneously. It's just a matter of time. With respect to the environment and the notion that civilizational stability is only guaranteed so long as a stationary bandit or encompassing interest group is exerting a stabilizing field within and around the societal system, anarcho-communism and run-of-the-mill anarchism seemingly reject this notion entirely, or actually they simply turn it on its head. They reject the Hobbesian anarchy as an inherently bad thing, and instead think that quote-unquote anarchy somehow is an ideal state. And anarcho-capitalism, in a similarly utopian vision, assumes that actors within the environment are all purely rational, peaceful, economically minded, good faith operators who will sit down and merely deduce the most mutually advantageous choice for all involved, such that the system naturally drifts towards Pareto efficient outcomes. In other words, an environment or state of nature in which coercion is simply inefficient, and thus the coercion mechanic is spontaneously and emergently blocked for use by the environment. Really, both ideological extremes at the heart of it reject the Hobbesian anarchy as the primordial state of nature, and the Hobbesian anarchy is either the true state of nature or it is not. In my opinion, it is the true state of nature. And if the Hobbesian anarchy is indeed the true state of nature, then all ideologies with an anarcho prefix are totally and absurdly utopian. So, in my aspirationally non-utopian view, it is only the state or a sedentary bandit with a suitably encompassing interest which provides this environmental stability and law and order in the first place. Only the sedentary bandit, or in Hobbes's terms, the Leviathan, has the ability to suppress the variety of the Hobbesian anarchy. From the last video on Stafford Beer's Cybernetics and Ashby, any viable system must be able to adequately restrain the variety from its environment, and this environment, especially in the absence of a state, is the Hobbesian anarchy. So the dream that the state will spontaneously dissolve and that the people will merely mutually transact and render mutual aid to one another in spontaneously emergent communes, or rationally and voluntarily transact with their fellow homo economicuses, will only last so long as a roving bandit does not sweep in to steal everything and torch the place. And this is why the sedentary bandit, or the Leviathan in Hobbesian language, will always naturally emerge. If the Leviathan is forcefully disassembled, it will reassemble and reanimate spontaneously. It is just a matter of time. But whatever, I could spend more time beating a dead horse, and I don't want to get too sidetracked into the ideology debate. But with that little economic side quest completed, we can get back onto the main path, a main path that perhaps inevitably leads to the super-encompassing interest, to the single globalized and technicized Leviathan. If pre-World War II saw the global order broken up into a patchwork quilt of nation-state-sized sedentary bandits, and if the post-World War II Cold War period saw the world broken up into a binary and increasingly managerial superstate system, then perhaps the post-1991, post-Soviet collapse period has already seen a strong turn in the direction of this so-called globalized, super-encompassing interest, a new order of sorts. And this new order has been emerging for the better part of a century already. James Burnham foretold of this managerial revolution in the 1940s, a social transition that would come in stages. Due to the increasing demands of mass and scale, World War I could be said to have marked the beginning of the Managerial Revolution, while by the end of World War II, managerialism had already largely come to displace the legacy system of bourgeois capitalism. The capitalist owners, those who both owned and more importantly controlled the means of production, increasingly had their control taken away, and control was subsumed by the managers, bureaucrats, and technicians, a more delocalized and nebulous group. Remember, ownership means nothing without control. To quote Burnham on this transition, who writes to us from 1941, "The theory holds to begin with that we are now in a period of social transition. This transition is from the type of society which we have called capitalist or bourgeois to a type of society which we will call managerial. What is occurring in this transition is a drive for social dominance, for power and privilege, for the position of the ruling class, by the social group or class of managers, as I shall call them. This drive will be successful. At the conclusion of the transition period, the managers will, in fact, have achieved social dominance and will be the ruling class in society. This drive, moreover, is worldwide in extent, already advanced in all nations, though at a different level of development in all nations." End quote. And then if we attempt to join these two concepts, the Managerial Revolution and the super-encompassing interest of Olson, we could propose that the ultimate and final stage of managerialism is a type of globalized managerialism, a managerial mesh that expands its reach to such a degree that its interests become super-encompassing. And I would propose that final stage began in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then its consolidation began accelerating rapidly in the years following 2001, after China joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO. And today, in 2026, I would propose this end state of the super-encompassing interest has already been more or less achieved. Well, besides two obstinate autarkic nodes anyway, two autarkic nodes which, if you read the news, alternate between dominating the headlines, Iran and Russia. Or that is a hypothesis anyway, which we will devote the rest of the video to discussing. But of course, there is the massive challenge of a single super-encompassing interest ever coming into being in the first place, nonetheless surviving for very long. In his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, James Burnham described the challenges of constructing and sustaining such a globalized single-world state. And when we read these following passages, we can think back to the last video about the emerging algorithmic and AI control system, a new emerging and nearly totalizing metasystem that has already extended its claws deep into the psyches of much of the globalized mass. An emerging algorithmic and AI control system that perhaps will have the capacity to restrain all of the variety of the globalized masses. Further, in lieu of fighting amongst one another, the increasingly post-national elites of the post-2001 China WTO world order, those of the delocalized managerial mesh, perhaps have indeed arranged a control system of their own, engineered dependency on the globalized and technicized economic machine, and the game theoretical mechanic of mutually assured economic destruction. The post-national elites of the managerial mesh all get rich so long as no one steps out of line. And if anyone steps out of line, their node will immediately be shut out and isolated from the network. Further, presumably, an equally nebulous control system, a sinister type, an unseen algorithmic loop of carrots and sticks, exists to police this circle of sharks. As there is no honor amongst thieves, after all, compromising arrangements must be made, those which appeal to self-interest, for sharks know of no other type, traces of which to the discerning viewer perhaps may also show up in the headlines. To quote Burnham, writing to us from the year 1941, on the eve of America's entry into World War II, and from the pages of his Managerial Revolution, on the challenges of arranging such things. To quote Burnham, "Nevertheless, it is extremely doubtful that the world political system of managerial society will be organized within the discernible future as a single world state. If we leave words and get closer to practical details, the organization of the entire world under a single sovereign state power seems to present difficulties that are close to insuperable. These difficulties are of many kinds. First, there are technical and administrative difficulties. The centralized direction of the whole world and all of its people would be a task beyond the technical ability of any human group so far. The job is just too vast. Second, there is the military and police problem. There seems no reason to believe that any state can organize a military group sufficiently large and sufficiently cohesive to be able to patrol the whole world. And even if one single power managed to do so, maintaining this would be nearly impossible because the disintegrative forces would be sufficient to pull it rapidly to pieces. Third, the ethnic, cultural, social, and climatic diversities of the world are so considerable that it precludes its reduction to a political unity. A world state would presuppose a large measure of general social unity among men in interests and culture and education and material standards of life, etc. End quote. Yes, indeed. And of course, Burnham wrote this over 80 years ago. But from our vantage point in 2026, we can actually say that all three of these factors have been, or are at least being, mitigated. So really, we are merely waiting to see whether it is stable long-term, rather than if it is indeed possible to attain at all. For the first point about the technical and administrative complexity being insurmountable, the globalized managerial mesh already manages the global economy and all of its complex supply chains via cybernetic management techniques, AI, and algorithms. And really, it already does this and has been doing this to a mind-boggling degree for at least 10 years now. But of course, in 1941, it was not possible for Burnham to foresee and understand the true extent of what was to come, the digital, informational, and now AI revolutions. For the second part, although it seemed unlikely in 1941, when Burnham was writing The Managerial Revolution, the U.S. military has indeed, since 1991, been more or less the world police, especially with respect to guaranteeing free passage through maritime shipping routes. And for the privilege of accessing these maritime shipping routes, which are kept open by the U.S. Navy, the world economy, which primarily runs on U.S. dollars, pays a sort of infrastructure access tax in the form of absorbing externalities from U.S. dollar money printing, inflation, in other words. And since the supply of U.S. dollars as the global reserve currency must continuously expand as the global economy expands, this whole thing takes on a life of its own. This is otherwise known as the Triffin dilemma, which highlights the inherent tensions for a global reserve currency. In order to provide enough currency to meet the outsized demand that arises from facilitating international trade, a trade deficit inevitably results, while the value of the global reserve currency is kept inflated. Rather than merely representing domestic productive capacity, the U.S. dollar must serve double duty, increasing its supply to accommodate the ever-expanding global demand for dollars. Further, China, which is a near rival to the U.S., cannot easily try to make a move and supplant the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, because doing so would greatly destabilize its export-dependent economy, which relies upon a cheap yuan rather than an overpriced yuan. And ideas that some conglomeration of BRICS nations will create an alternative global currency that could rival the U.S. dollar too is further complicated by many factors, the primary one being trust. The U.S. is merely the devil that the post-national elites know, and the status quo devil that you know is generally preferable to the devil that you don't know. Further, if anyone makes too strong a move against the U.S., suddenly the world police, or one of its many shadowy appendages, may suddenly either 1. Stir up some trouble in your backyard, thereby driving up the transactional costs of merely existing, or 2. Call off its globalized police force entirely, and suddenly you will find yourself surrounded by a sea of roving bandits, and the darkness of the Hobbesian Anarchy may descend rapidly. If one stops and evaluates many of the seemingly contradictory things that the U.S. foreign policy establishment does and funds in this lens, it suddenly does not seem so bizarre and contradictory after all. Perhaps, as it always is, through the lens of utility, the picture is clear, while through a lens streak smeared with sentiments and metaphysics underwritten by dogmatic a prioris, it is, as one would expect, cloudy. Plus, if the U.S. military really pulls back its presence, not only will the transactional cost of accessing the globalized maritime shipping routes rise dramatically, but every nation in the patchwork quilt would have to waste more and more of their own internal resources on territorial defense and military spending, rather than merely outsourcing it to the U.S. military. Perhaps, as it generally is, outsourcing is a bargain. Plus, there is the tendency that when neighboring countries start remilitarizing, it dramatically increases the potential that the neighboring countries will go to war, a very economically destructive affair, something that functional disarmament precludes. And then, broadly, there is the issue of a power vacuum. If the U.S. military were to abruptly pull back its globalized police force, it is unknowable how many regional conflicts would either spring up organically and or be further fueled by aspiring regional empire builders. As much as people may point out the ways that the U.S. military destabilizes certain areas of the globe, They almost never bother to imagine what the resulting power vacuum would look like if the US military suddenly pulled back from its global role and began only bothering to patrol its own backyard, primarily because these types of people are Rousseauian idealists or even utopian types who reject the idea of the Hobbesian anarchy in the first place. They think power vacuums are merely filled with butterflies, daisies, and fields filled with frolicking humans. If we briefly look at how many regional wars sprung up in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the wake of the power vacuum that emerged when the Soviet Empire collapsed, there were many. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the US military, already having built itself into a nearly globalized force during the Cold War, was able to easily step into that power vacuum and to provide a degree of stabilization and order. And with the Soviet threat having just only vanished in the 1990s, Western Europe still maintained a sizable military force as well. Today, Europe is just a shell of its former self. The French were recently and embarrassingly kicked out of Africa, where they have since been replaced largely by Russian mercenary forces. And then, for the UK military, long gone are the days when Britannia ruled the waves, with that duty having since been handed off to the US in the aftermath of World War II. But who would do this today? Who would step into that Earth-sized power vacuum if the US military simply took its ball and went home, like so many people ask it to do? Russia, as it has already begun doing, is increasingly serving a role as a military stabilizer in parts of Africa, but Russia is only a shadow of its former Soviet self. Further, Russia's existing sphere of influence is rapidly shrinking in Central and West Asia, a waning power rather than a waxing one. And China, perhaps wisely, because it is a dirty and thankless job, seems very reluctant to step into this role of policing faraway lands. And unlike the US and the Russians, the Chinese have no recent history or experience in the global policing game. And of course, if China was forced to invest resources into building a globalized police force, it would mean less resources devoted to maintaining and improving its industrial engine at home. So anyway, that is the US's role in this whole affair, the world police. Many people wish for the US military to abandon its role as the world police and to pull back to its backyard. But as with many things, be careful what you wish for, because you may just get it, and what you get may not be what you had expected. And then the other main pole of this globalized managerial mesh is, of course, China. If all nation-states are downstream of the US military, then all nations, similarly, are downstream of China's industrial engine. In other words, it is an intertwined system of dependencies. If the Cold War was a bipolar system, one where each pole was zero-sum and primarily non-cooperative with the other, our present system is dominated by profoundly obvious cooperation between the two poles, the US and China. In other words, there exists no true hostility between the US and China. They are cooperative partners, and the empirical evidence bears this out. The foreign direct investment, the technology transfers, and the decades of high-level economic cooperation and trade make this hard to deny. And understanding China's role, and thus its power in this whole arrangement, is obvious, as China, of course, controls the global industrial engine on which the entire world is now dependent. Superficially, it could be said that China has the advantage in this cooperative game with the US. China could merely pull the plug and it would be lights out. But China's industrial engine, the heart of the global economy, is a very sensitive thing, and it is dependent on a stable flow of inputs from its surrounding environment, a surrounding environment which the US military still largely controls, or at the very least, has the power to make very unstable. And this brings us to the Thucydides trap broadly, the potential direct conflict that occurs when one empire rises while another falls, at the present level of our destructive technology, simply cannot come to pass, and thus, or so I would propose, the post-national, globalized, and delocalized managerial mesh sought to engineer a checkmate, mutually assured economic destruction. And why, after all, should anyone seek to upset the apple cart when everyone can just keep making money? Why risk seizing the island where most of the world's semiconductors come from when there is the risk that an object suddenly falls out of space and lands on your very big and precariously located hydroelectric dam? And thus, the game of cooperation continues, because to disrupt the cooperative game with anything other than a minor tit-for-tat would be too costly for the players. In the spirit of the last video in the viable systems model, what we're discussing here is an algedonic loop, carrots and sticks, pleasure and pain, reward versus risk. and the highest order meta-language of the geopolitical system above all is utility and not verbal, sentiment-laden magic. The meta-language is never ideological, never metaphysical. It is only game theory, utility, and cost-benefit analysis. And generally, I'd say the post-national elites of this delocalized managerial mesh of this super-encompassing interest group prefer making themselves richer rather than trying to upset the apple cart. Further, thanks to the globalized reach of algorithmic social media and synthetic, simulacra-like informational environments, the whirring kaleidoscope that results can create for the globalized masses the illusion that some great battle, the cosmic fight for justice, is being waged. But in reality, the globalized and technicized economic machine and its post-national elite managers are all working cooperatively to maintain the system because they all have an interest in doing so, a super-encompassing interest to keep doing so. So here we arrive at an inversion of sorts. The swimming duck, when viewed from above the waterline, it is said, appears serene and calm as it seemingly glides effortlessly across the surface of a placid lake. Whereas in reality, beneath the surface, his little flipper duck feet frantically churn and paddle away. But for us, the globalized masses, we see the inversion of the duck, a complex, chaotic surface image, an algorithmically tuned and delivered hologram of a global system on the verge of catastrophic collapse. Civil wars and world wars just around the corner, but this is merely done to keep us on edge, to keep us distracted, or to keep us hoping that some cosmic justice of one kind or another will surely be delivered in the next story arc or in the next season that is the reality show that is America and the globalized soap opera. In other words, it forms the illusion that Orwell wrote about in 1984, an illusion of globalized conflict between rival superstates, but one which is primarily synthetic, informational, and psychological rather than truly kinetic, a world order that is kept maintained by the illusion of globalized conflict, one where Oceania is always at war with Eurasia or East Asia or both or neither, who knows. And that gets into the third part of Burnham's argument against such a totalized system of governance. The globalized masses are simply too culturally diverse to be forced into some kind of single global unity. But in 2026, such a thing is increasingly possible, especially when we consider the progressive exposure that the younger generations get to the online, algorithmically mediated information space. Cheap smartphones and widespread internet access have increasingly led more and more of the international globalized masses to the same informational ecosystems, to the same common social media platforms, YouTube, X, Twitch, TikTok, Facebook, etc. And these platforms do indeed have a profound siloizing and deracinating influence on the globalized masses, especially the youth. A random dude in Tunisia might have more in common interest-wise with a random dude in the middle of Indiana than he does with his closest Tunisian dude neighbor. And the hyper-tailored interests or kaleidoscope of hyper-tailored interests that people now have, thanks to algorithms, will most likely only continue in the future. Further, with information technology, algorithms, and AI, it is not necessary to forcefully amalgamate everyone into a single global unity. Instead, it is merely sufficient to siloize the global masses into some algorithmically managed truth regimes, synthetic informational realities, often of a subjective mental type. And then, once siloized, superfluous tensions can be dissipated via aggregation and deaggregation cycles, mass balanced and force canceled by clever geometry, the geometry of the architecturally arranged truth regime silos, always dynamic and never static, dissipative structures. And then, perhaps every now and then, especially in the autarkic nodes, which resist the super-encompassing interest, physical world conflicts will come into being, but they will be kept isolated, unfortunate sacrificial anodes that maintain the integrity of the overarching globalized supersystem, to maintain the integrity of the super-encompassing interest group itself. But anyway, on this topic of managing the globalized masses, I won't go too deep into this, as this was the main topic of my last video, as well as my past video about Turchin's metasystems, wherein the emerging quantum 7 metasystem is the so-called control of culture, one where culture itself becomes infinitely malleable, synthetic, and commoditized. Or alternatively, I am totally wrong, and the world is just about to slip into anarchy and dissolution, just like all of the most popular algorithmically preferred content wants us to think, but yet here I am at the bottom of YouTube, so make of that what you will. And unless you are insane, global dissolution and a descent into world war is very, very bad, and thus, as I explained in the last video, such a trajectory is much worse than the dystopianly optimistic picture I'm painting here. And with that said, we'll wrap the video up by revisiting the preview that I originally wrote for this video, which roughly goes as follows. Mancur Olson's book, Power and Prosperity, Outgrowing Communist and Capitalist Dictatorships, was published posthumously in the year 2000. A year or so later, in 2001, China would join the World Trade Organization, and the final stage of the Managerial Revolution would begin. I bought this book because it discusses a very interesting dynamic in the evolution of civilizations. As a society develops, it goes from a state of anarchy, one ruled by what Olson calls the roving bandits, and then over time, a particularly successful roving bandit settles down and becomes a sedentary bandit. Such sedentary bandits are ultimately responsible for forging a society and ultimately a civilization by providing security for his now sedentary and stationary community, such that long-term investments, infrastructure building, and technological specialization can occur. In other words, the sedentary bandit begins to build an encompassing interest in the society that he is ruling, governing, and building. This is the genesis point of a civilization, one where the people who increasingly inhabit this system are transitioned from a state of anarchy and entropy to one of law and order, private property, and contract law, the building blocks of civilization. But civilizational history has, up until this point, still largely been a patchwork of various local sedentary bandits, nation-states, and regional empires. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, however, we had reached the monopolar moment, and the opportunity had seemingly come to finally build that single totalizing, super-encompassing interest, one that would span nearly the entire globe, except for some rebellious autarkic nodes maybe. This, as they called it, was the end of history, and perhaps they were right. Francis Fukuyama, coincidentally, the man who penned that famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, reviewed Mancur Olson's book, Power and Prosperity, and his blurb appears on the back of the paperback edition. So perhaps Mancur Olson, prior to his untimely death, was indeed onto something. Further, with respect to investments, a long-term investment horizon and guaranteed stability over a long-term period is ultimately necessary, such that the returns on an investment can be maximized. And indeed, the past 30 years have seen profound investments come to fruition. And as we saw in the last video, global poverty rates have since plummeted, and in turn, global fertility rates have largely dropped to more sustainable levels. World War II ended 80 years ago. We have not faced another destructive world war since. And realistically, humanity would not survive another one anyway. And perhaps when the relationship between the US and China is viewed in this way, along with the shareholder aggregators, the asset managers, the vast wealth redistribution events that have occurred over the past 3 decades, and the general themes we can extract from the World Economic Forum doctrines, we can perhaps best understand this constellation of things in the lens of the super-encompassing interest group. While reading the early pages of Power and Prosperity, specifically the following excerpts, I had a sort of eureka moment, a sudden understanding about globalization had crystallized for me, and the trajectory of the last 30 years suddenly made perfect sense. It was this imperative to create this ultimate super-encompassing interest group, one that would grow to consume the entire world. And it would be one ruled by a globalized and delocalized post-national group of elites, one where this necessary condition, overarching global stability, specifically the security of international maritime routes, would be guaranteed by the might of the U.S. military, the world police, while China would become the world's factory, one hand washing the other, making money hand over fist. Further, in the decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, while China built its industrial engine, the U.S. would funnel almost all investments into information technology, the instruments needed to maintain cybernetic control over an increasingly globalized and technicized economic machine, as well as the increasingly globalized masses. And internally, China would do the same for its own people. And, or as the theory goes anyway, as this group's interests become super-encompassing, they begin to approach quote-unquote benevolence, and perhaps benevolence on a global scale looks a certain way. Perhaps it looks just like how the world looks in 2026, if one is a hyper-realist anyway. And at this point in the video, we're finally ready for the excerpts from Mancur Olson's Power and Prosperity that address this so-called super-encompassing interest group. To quote Olson, "We have now examined the logic of power for interests so narrow that they take no account of the interests of society, i.e. criminals and roving bandit types and Hobbesian anarchies, or pseudo-Hobbesian anarchies, and for interests with such an encompassing stake, i.e. a super-encompassing interest group, that their self-interest leads them to act as though they were totally benevolent. In this analysis, I have taken it for granted that each interest has an incentive to think of the long run, what economists refer to as a borrow infinite planning horizon. In reality, some interests have no reason to be concerned about the long run. For very narrow interests, i.e. criminal and roving bandit types in anarchic environments, this makes no difference. They take little or no account of the interests of society, whether they are thinking of the long run or the short run. For the encompassing interest, it makes a great deal of difference. We know that an economy will generate its maximum income only if there is a high rate of investment, and that much of the return on long-term investment is received long after the investments are made. To reach the maximum income attainable at a given tax rate, a society must enforce contracts, including those involving long-term loans, impartially, but the full gains are again reaped only in the long run. To obtain the full advantage from long-run contracts, a country also needs a stable currency. A stationary bandit, i.e. an encompassing interest, will therefore reap the maximum harvest in taxes, and his subjects will get the largest gains from this encompassing interest in the productivity of his domain, only if he is taking an infinitely long view, and only if his subjects have total confidence that the right to private property and impartial contract enforcement will be permanently respected, and that the coin or currency will retain its full value." End quote. And for that last part anyway, we can only assume that one day the returns will have been suitably maximized such that the need to guarantee us, the globalized masses, private property rights and impartial contract enforcement will end, and we will own nothing, because ultimately to own something is to have an interest, and if an interest group is to become truly super-encompassing, it must own and control all of the resources. And here we can wrap the video up with a brief discussion about George Orwell, who, it is said, modeled his infamous dystopian novel 1984 after James Burnham's 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution. And here, perhaps, we can see how the last step of this process of building the super-encompassing interest will be completed, with the instrumental utility providing reanimated zombie corpse of socialism. But what is meant by socialism? Burnham describes socialism in the context of the Managerial Revolution as follows. The word socialism is used for ideological purposes in order to manipulate the favorable mass emotions attached to the historical socialist ideal of a free, classless, and international society, and to hide the fact that the managerial economy is in actuality the basis for a new kind of exploiting class society. End quote. In other words, this is the false god of socialism. Socialism will not lead to common and collective ownership, but it will be used instrumentally to extract the last bits of capital from the residual elements of the Western middle classes, most of which at this point is held in the savings accounts, 401ks, and real estate valuations of the rapidly aging baby boomer generation. And really, we could say that this has always been the true role of socialism, and thus its true utility. It provides a simple, potent justification, one that appeals to the sentiments of the masses, that facilitates capital extraction from what is typically the middle-class elements of a society. The truly wealthy will flee with their money and resources, pay to smuggle themselves and their valuables out to safer pastures, but the middle class, those who only have some wealth and who themselves exist in much greater numerical abundance than the wealthy, are always the ultimate targets of socialism. This is a potent example of the so-called Juvenalian high-low middle control mechanism, the means by which the high timelessly allies itself with the low, such that the productive middle can be squeezed, extracted, and controlled. It is order from chaos in microcosm. Independently and efficiently, the middle creates order, neg entropy, and then the abundant chaos agents which overpopulate the low, forever trapped in short-term thought and impulsive covetousness, grasp, claw, and steal away the order that is rendered by the middle or by their more productive, aspirant co-members of the low. because what I am talking about here is intrinsically linked to behavior rather than pure class. And after the extractive theft has occurred, and the immediate thereafter, the ill-gotten gains, the negentropic order, is immediately consumed without any care for the thought or labor that went into its making. What can be consumed immediately will be consumed. What can be spent immediately will be spent, smoked, drank, or gambled away. Easy come, easy go. And once it is gone, shortly thereafter, the coveters will soon be in need again. Teach a man to fish, and he will feed himself for life. But if you condition a man to expect to receive free fish for nothing, to give a man a fish, then you will need to continue giving him a fish, lest he one day burns down your house in anger when the gifts of free fish stop. Or in a more sinister fashion, the high can harness this anger and cybernetically steer and direct it to attack certain targets, which is often the middle. And the middle is always the easiest and most convenient target for this because, after all, the wealth of the middle is not stored high up in a castle somewhere beyond reach and out of view, but rather it is left mostly unguarded, while its visibility to the low only enhances its covetability. And of course, this game never ends. And out of a need to distance themselves from the worst of the low, the middle must continue to work ever harder, continue to innovate, pay their taxes, and try to wall themselves off from the low as much as it is possible. And meanwhile, somewhere in the rarefied upper air of the layer cake, the high watches down upon their domain and its clockwork mechanism, extracting taxes forevermore, while always making sure to keep the wheels of this mechanism greased by providing enough free handouts to the low, such that they will continue terrorizing the middle, thereby driving the productivity of the middle, their innovation, and most importantly, the quantity of their taxable revenue. And this Juvenalian high-low middle control mechanism has been increasingly deployed by the managerial state. Really, it is the weapon of choice. In the past, when societies were poor, there were limits to how much it could be really used by the high because it is profoundly perverse. But in our wealthy, postmodern, post-industrialized societies, it becomes the preferred control mechanism. What better way to extract the stored wealth of the Western middle classes and to slowly restructure society that the dependency of the masses are maximized, such that any rival or independent fiefdoms, no matter how small and insignificant, are dismantled and destroyed? To quote George Orwell in his response to Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, "Capitalism is disappearing, but socialism is not replacing it. What is now arising is a new kind of planned centralized society, which will be neither capitalist nor, in any accepted sense of the word, democratic. The rulers of this new society will be the people who effectively control the means of production. That is, business executives, technicians, bureaucrats, and soldiers, lumped together by Burnham under the name of managers. These people will eliminate the old capitalist class, crush the working class, and so organize society that all power and economic privilege remain in their own hands. Private property rights will be abolished, but common ownership will not be established." End quote. Or, as it is sometimes said, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And if I have done my job of explaining why this is the case reasonably well, perhaps you too will now understand why this is the case, just as I have realized it myself. Really, it is the 5 stages of grief, with the final step being acceptance. I generally strive to provide value-free analysis that hopefully closely approximates reality, so I am not saying that I am happy about any of this. I don't like it at all, but just merely that I think it is the case. I could describe my work as utility theory rather than conspiracy theory. And similarly, if one understands the utility behind all of this, hoping that something much different will happen becomes a form of futility. So I suppose my genre is utility theory and futility studies. But no matter how bad or unappealing something seems, remember it could always be worse. Should one not learn to love Big Brother, one may be forcibly made to do so anyway. But unlike the nightmarish visions laid out by Orwell, what lies behind the door of Room 101, in what may have been a kind of over-exaggerated preparatory conditioning phase, a way to subtly inject the most extreme variants of these concepts into our collective unconscious well in advance, such that we would readily come to the negotiating table and readily accept milder terms when the time was right. Our Big Brother reality is instead one of algorithmically delivered entertainment, distractions, and if you're not careful, derangement. In other words, really, it is not so bad. And thus, if you think about it, You will own nothing and be happy, where happy is a relative term. Happy compared to something much more visceral, something much more horrible, something in the style of Room 101. Checkmate indeed. Further, objectively, one must strive to really understand what is the worst case scenario. I would say the unrestrained Hobbesian anarchy and the resulting collapse in the global carrying capacity of the planet and what that means for the globalized masses is actually objectively worst of all. And we cannot forget the horrors of World War, perhaps a close runner-up when compared with a return to pure Hobbesian anarchy. In between World War I and World War II, in the span of around 30 years, and while the global population was only around 2 billion, industrialized warfare between the sedentary bandits of the European nation-states resulted in the deaths of approximately 110 million people. In the decades after World War II and after the invention of the atomic bomb, in that 80-year period perhaps, only 20 to 40 million people have been killed by industrialized warfare, while the global population has since skyrocketed to nearly 8.5 billion people. That, objectively, for the murderous species that is humanity, is progress. So really, what is the cost to humanity if such a globalized, super-encompassing interest group exists, or if it continues to exist? The one that has, under its tenure, seemingly held back the deaths of tens or even hundreds of millions of lives, versus the cost that humanity will face if we return back to the nation-state model, or even worse yet, the pure Hobbesian anarchy. In the constrained vision of Thomas Sowell, there are, of course, trade-offs. Geopolitical realism asserts that geopolitics is the Hobbesian anarchy, and in past versions of the system, there existed no higher authority, no globalized sedentary bandit of a sufficiently encompassing interest to restrain the individual nation-states of the world, to keep them from destroying one another. But perhaps today that is no longer the case. Perhaps what we have lived under for the past 30 or so years is this newly emergent, super-encompassing interest. Or maybe we should optimistically hope that that is the case, for the alternatives may be much, much worse. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I could continue to elaborate on this further, but perhaps you already get my point, and either agree or disagree. And you can also reference the last video about Stafford Beer, cybernetics, and variety, as well as Turchin's emerging metasystem transition video, as there's significant overlap conceptually. Further, another past video about globalism, only power restrains power, globalism, the Machiavellians, and liberty, similarly covered the emergence of this globalized machine. And then on the topic of synthetic ideologies and ideological inoculants, referred to the West's bizarre ideology, subjective mental reality, and the delusional telos, or my other videos about propaganda, referencing Jacques Ellul and Edward Bernays. But for now, I'll call it a day, and stay tuned for the next one. I may dive into Gaetano Mosca's What is Mafia next, as it provides for a pretty good overlap with Olson's emergent sedentary bandit model. And then at some point, we'll dive into Pareto's classification of residues and anticipate how the social equilibrium and the distribution of these residue classes may change as a result of the new algorithmic and AI-managed metasystem in which we increasingly live. But until then, thanks again for watching. Special thanks to my patrons and YouTube members, and have a nice day or night.